Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'd like to discuss something slightly different. I want to talk about the 2021 documentary Get Back that was released on Disney+. This is a three-part series that is over 9 hours, I believe, and this was compiled by Peter Jackson, who painstakingly took the 150 hours of footage taken from the Beatles' last session, recording their last two albums, and made this into a wonderful little docu-series, if you will. And I'd like to sort of review it, as well as give you 3 reasons I think you need to watch this, whether you're a Beatles fan or not. And I'll roll into the first reason, which is this definitely feels like a film. Now, the effort and the time taken to compile all this and go over it and decide what should remain and what should be left out, these people did a very good job with. And this originally was taken from the 1970 Let It Be film. The footage was shot back then, and all of it was, I guess they had only wanted to release 90 minutes of it, which was the Let It Be movie. And that film, as good as it was, really painted, I think, a different picture than what we're getting with Peter Jackson's version of this. And by that I mean, this very much so shows the Beatles in a different light than what we were told. And I'll get into that a little bit later. That is another reason I think you should watch this. But this does feel like a movie. It has sort of an arc. There are kind of the fact that there are 3 distinct segments, sort of like a movie. They're acts in themselves, and I just think it was the way that it played out and the dynamic between all of the members that we know and love was just really well represented and really well edited together to give you the feeling that they had in the studio. So you really feel like you're there. You feel immersed in this experience, and you feel that it's very cinematic in a way. Not to mention that this has been, touched up, I'm sure, visually, and the audio there have been serious improvements since 1970. So the audio is just impeccable in this. The dialogue is incredibly crisp, and there are scenes, I'm sure, in the 1970 film Let It Be where a character is speaking and you can just barely make out what they're saying. In this, everything is clear, and the dialogue and the conversation just flows really, really natural. So that would be my first reason. This is definitely very cinematic. And my second reason would be that this gives you really the deepest insight that we've ever seen into the group. These guys changed history as we know it. They were one of the most influential bands of all time in the world. And, this gives us a look at them when they start off at Twickenham, which is this huge warehouse where I believe they shot movies in England. And they rented out this space, and it really didn't work for them. It really didn't work for them. They ended up moving. But to give you a little background, the Beatles had stopped touring in 1966. And they had, I believe, briefly separated for maybe less than a year before the making of this in 1970. And, Let It Be, even though that was their last released album to the public, was actually recorded before the Abbey Road songs. They all pretty much agreed to come back and cut the rest of these songs for these albums, and they allowed cameras in. And I believe they originally had intended for this to be a television series, and as I've said earlier, it became a 1970 movie, Let It Be. In this, we really see that Paul is definitely taking command. John, who is sort of the father of the Beatles and the founder, is really taking a backseat here. He's been involved with Yoko for a few years now, and Yoko is just at his side every waking moment during these recordings, which I know has been the center of a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion as to her part in the Beatles breaking up. But I think this shows that that's not completely accurate. I'm sure the band members were not thrilled that she was there. But this doesn't show Yoko to be any kind of a real nuisance. For the better part of this documentary, she's sitting quietly, respectful of John and the band members and what they're trying to create. And I think that it showed an actually kind of a heartwarming dynamic between John and Yoko. We know how strongly those two felt for one another, but it just really bleeds through the camera here, and it really, I felt it added a really necessary layer to everything. So Paul is really commanding the band at this point. He has to sort of crack the whip and get these guys going, writing, and getting things on paper, and finally putting them to the mic, because they do have a very tight turnaround. They keep showing a calendar starting at the beginning of January, and they're marking off days until the end of the month. And that is when they're supposed to have their final concert, which they were, I think, mulling over playing at one venue, and then they decide against it ultimately to play on the rooftop, but we'll get to that. So Paul is in command, and with this being said, George is growing increasingly more frustrated with this. George is sort of coming into his own as a guitarist, as a writer, and he really wants to input his creativity into John and Paul's writing, but is sort of shut down and met with a lot of criticisms from Paul, who was more or less a fanatic in the studio. And Ringo, we really see him staying to himself. Ringo is trying to have fun. I think Ringo knows it's over. He knows this is pretty much it for them, and he's just trying to live out the last moments of the Beatles in harmony. George, as he's fighting for creative control with Paul, eventually, becomes fed up. And I'm not ruining anything if any of you know the history of the band. If you don't, then log off now. This is a spoiler for you. But yeah, George ends up leaving the band briefly because he just feels that his input's just not validated, it's not respected, and they eventually have a band meeting, and there's a wonderful scene where they play recordings, and the backdrop are still images, but they planted microphones in this meeting that the Beatles had halfway through these sessions to try to convince George to come back. And it's just incredibly just fascinating stuff to listen to. So ultimately, when George does return, they become fed up with the vibe and the overall acoustics of Twickenham, and they decide to go to what we now know is Apple Corps Studio to finish the rest of these recordings. And this is where it really gets great and interesting, because the vibe is just tremendously better than what it was in Twickenham. The band is now starting to really joke around and be the lads that we all knew them to be. A lot of people think that the Beatles were very stoic and very whatever, but they were really pranksters. And 90% of this documentary, especially when we go to Apple Corps, is them just really fooling around, goofing off in the studio. A huge, huge part of this and their success with Abbey Road is the arrival of Billy Preston, who does wonders for the band's morale. His vibe was so needed, and it was what they were missing all along. I think they felt these songs for the most part were perfect, but they felt like there was something just missing. And Billy's organ playing, his key playing is just beyond reproach. And just the general vibe that he brought into the studio, he was the glue that held the group together. And the mood just generally improves once he arrives. There are just some really funny moments with Yoko and John singing and goofing off, and Paul's family coming in and his little girls, playing the drums with Ringo, and just some really, really fun, genuinely just awesome moments. So I kind of went on deep on my tangent with that reason that it is a insight into the look of this band. But I want to say the third reason is because yeah, it rewrites this history that we've all come to know, that the band broke up because Yoko was, I guess manipulative in the studio, or Paul was domineering as the new face and leader of the band. I don't think any of those things are true. I think that this documentary clearly lays out and shows that these guys were all just, they weren't even 30 yet. And the amount of success and fame and fortune that they acquired in such a short amount of time will do things to you. And they still had a lot left to give, but I think each and every one of them had their own vision, and they wanted to, good things come to an end. They wanted to branch out, right, and produce their own things and just have a little bit more creative freedom. So they all kind of went on their own way as pioneers of sorts. And, they gave us some of the most beautiful music in the world. So I think we need to be appreciative of that. Don't try to speculate or look too far into this group and why they separated. I think it was very natural and very organic. And I think all of them, in their own way, knew that this was coming to an end sooner or later. So I think this documentary was a gift because it rewrites history. It shows the Beatles' history for what it truly was. And, after everything is said and done, there is a 40 minute rooftop concert, the famous, fabled rooftop concert, which was their last performance and the last time all four of them played together. Iconic, historical, and it shows the reactions of the walking by citizens on the ground level, as well as the police and their efforts to shut them down. It's just incredible. This is a great documentary. If it is ever released on physical media, I will definitely pick this up. I think it's worth owning. And whether or not you are a Beatles fan, I think it can be enjoyed because it's a historical piece. And like I said, it doesn't feel like a documentary. It feels like a film. So there you go, guys. Those are 3 reasons I think you should watch this. Some of my thoughts on it. I'd like to know yours in the comments below. Let me know what you think. Have a good evening.